Right-wing partisanship and nativism. The question I will be answering is which demographic characteristic has the greatest effect on right-wing political partisanship, and how does this affect nativist attitudes? Nativism is an intense opposition to an internal minority on the grounds of its foreign connections. This is important for Canada because we have a high number of immigrants, and to ensure the integration and acceptance of these members, we need to understand why some people choose to reject them in adopting nativist attitudes. Here are my hypotheses with appropriate literature citations supporting each. H1. Respondents with greater right-wing partisanship are more likely to have greater nativist attitudes. If H1 is supported by the data, right-wing partisanship will then become the dependent variable, and subsequent hypotheses will examine which predictors affect right-wing partisanship, and then eventually will relate this back to nativism. H2. Respondents with religious involvement are more likely to have greater right-wing partisanship than those who do not. H3. Respondents who favor free trade with the U.S. are more likely to have greater right-wing partisanship than those who do not. H4. Respondents who are anti-welfare are more likely to have greater right-wing partisanship. H5. Respondents who have materialist as opposed to post-materialist values are more likely to have greater right-wing partisanship. And H6. Respondents who are tough on crime are more likely to have greater right-wing partisanship. My first dependent variable that I will be examining is nativism as measured by the nativist index I've constructed. The standardized item alpha is higher than all of the alpha if item deleted values and the required threshold value of 0.6. Therefore, this is a strong index with conceptual cohesiveness. The second dependent variable I will be using is interval data from the study, which is measuring right-wing partisanship. Testing H1 and bivariate regression. As we can see, the unstandardized coefficient B is statistically significant and indicates that there is a positive relationship between right-wing partisanship and nativism, such that a 1-unit increase in right partisanship leads to a 0.402 unit increase in nativism. The adjusted R-squared value tells us that partisanship explains 6.6% of variance in nativism. As we can see, H1 holds, and we can now examine which factors affect right partisanship. Here is a correlation matrix. As we can see, the correlation between each independent variable and right-wing partisanship, the dependent variable, are statistically significant, positive, and therefore there's a positive relationship between each. What's interesting is there's also a positive, strong, statistically significant relationship between two of the independent variables. Thus, we must do a multivariate regression and test for multicollinearity. Here's a multivariate regression. As we can see, the B values reinforce the correlation results that each relationship is significant and positive. If we examine the tolerance levels, all tolerance values are very high and close to 1.0. Therefore, there is no issue of multicollinearity, and we can proceed with these variables. Among the unstandardized beta units, tough on crime has the highest value, therefore has the strongest effect out of these independent variables on right-wing partisanship. We will investigate how tough on crime affects nativism later on in this report. The adjusted R-squared value indicates that these variables explain 22.4% of variance in right partisanship. Predicting for nativism. To test the relationship between tough on crime and nativism, I've constructed H7. Respondents who are tough on crime are more likely to have greater nativist attitudes. To further investigate how these three variables actually relate, let's do a hierarchical regression. I've entered both independent variables in steps to see how the addition of tough on crime affects the relationship between partisanship and nativism. As we can see, the partisanship's beta score dropped by over a third, and therefore it's an explanation because being tough on crime can affect your political orientation and your attitudes towards immigrants, as per the Dinas article cited earlier. The adjusted R-squared value tells us that partisanship and tough on crime explain 22.8% of the variance in nativist scores. Since tough on crime has proven to be an even stronger indicator of nativism, as per its higher beta in step 2, let's further examine it. Here's a cross-tabulation. As we can see, the tau C is very strong, perhaps even worrisomely so. However, we know that they are measuring different concepts, and therefore it is still okay to use because none of the concepts in the index relate to criminality. We can also see that this relationship is not just very strong, but it's also very statistically significant. As we can see, the bulk of respondents who scored low on the nativism index are not tough on crime, whereas the bulk of respondents with stronger nativist attitudes are tough on crime. Thus, there is a clear positive relationship between being tough on crime and nativism. I wanted to further investigate this relationship, so I created control tables controlling for a lack of socialization with immigrants. I found that the tau C value stayed relatively the same, very strong, and statistically significant. Thus, I found a replication of the relationship between partisanship and nativism, even when controlling for socialization. I also computed an interaction variable between the x and z values, but its b was not statistically significant. I've created a graphical representation of my findings in this path analysis. H1, bivariate regression found that an increase in right-wing partisanship led to an increase in nativism with a 0.259 standardized beta score. Thus, since H1 held, we could examine which factors affected right-wing partisanship. H2 was proven true with a 0.157 beta. H3 was proven true as the relationship between favoring free trade and right-wing partisanship had a beta of 0.138. H4 was proven as being anti-welfare produced a beta of 0.210. H5 was also proven as the relationship between materialist values and right partisanship produced a beta of 0.147. H6 was also proven with a beta of 0.215 for the relationship between being tough on crime and right partisanship. These variables accounted for 22% of the variance in right partisanship. We then completed hierarchical regression, testing how right partisanship and being tough on crime affected nativism. H7 was proven true, as the relationship between being tough on crime and nativism produced a beta of 0.422. We also found in this hierarchical analysis that there was an explanation of the relationship between right partisanship and nativism, as the beta for partisanship dropped by over a third to 0.133. The adjusted R-squared tells us that being tough on crime and partisanship explain 22.8% of nativism variance. All hypotheses were proven true. As the strongest indicator for partisanship, being tough on crime was investigated further. We found that a positive, significant relationship between being tough on crime and nativism, and that also helped explain the relationship between partisanship and nativism. Controlling for contact with immigrants produced a replication of the strong relationship between being tough on crime and nativism. Future research could use other control variables to see how they react with being tough on crime and nativism. And future policy could include launching ad campaigns and increased awareness of how hard it is to get into Canada and be an immigrant to change public perception and decrease the correlation between being tough on crime and being anti-immigrant as evidenced by nativist attitudes.